Baby, can't you hear my call? I can't stand.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Hey Now podcast. I'm Dave Sims with my sons, Jarrett and Jordan. Special guest this week, a good friend, Bob Costas. 29 Emmys under his belt, 12 Olympic Games, beloved baseball, football, basketball, and Olympic host. Recently retired from calling baseball games. We'll talk about that. And Robert, we are delighted to have you with us. How are things with you?
All good. Happy post-Thanksgiving and an early Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
You betcha. You betcha. We want to take this from the beginning, Coach. All right?
Okay.
Little Bob Costas, Long Island, birth of a broadcaster. I mean, you were playing ball, but when did you decide that you want to have a microphone in your face?
Well, it's a story I've often told, so if any of your audience has heard it before, now's the time to get some refreshments or visit the restroom. I'll give you the original version. Like every kid in the late 50s and early 60s, I wasn't just a sports fan. I was a baseball fan first and foremost because baseball was the unquestioned national pastime. And growing up on Long Island, the Mets don't come into existence until 1962, by which time I'm 10. The Dodgers and Giants, whom I vaguely remember in Brooklyn and at the Polo Grounds when I was like 5, they've left for the West Coast. So in that 5-year span, there's only one team, and that team is the Yankees. They're the best team in the American League. They didn't win the pennant in 1959. All the other years they did win the pennant through 1964. And Mickey Mantle is the best player in the American League. So I have a cousin, my lifelong closest friend, and he's a little older than me. So he was a Giant fan. He remembers going to the Polo Grounds, and he rooted for Willie Mays. That's the first game he ever saw. Well, I was stuck with, that's not the right word, but it was the only choice was Mickey Mantle. So he was my guy, even though as I learned more about baseball, I certainly appreciated the other great players of the era, more of whom, by the way, were in the National League than in the American League. But anyway, I'm rooting for Mantle and the Yankees. And, you know, in that generation, we didn't collect baseball cards as an investment. We put them on the spokes of our bikes to make that clipping sound while you pedaled around the neighborhood. We traded them, we flipped them, we played various games with them. They had sentimental value. And I think, I can't trace an exact date, but by the time I'm 9 or 10, I'm aware of the broadcasters. At that point, Red Barber, who became legendary with the Brooklyn Dodgers, by that time he's paired with Mel Allen, and Phil Rizzuto has joined them on the Yankee games. And then in 62, Lindsey Nelson and Bob Murphy were the guys I thought of as the Mets announcers, and Ralph Kiner I thought of as not a play-by-play guy, although we did some, but as a color man. So I leaned toward the classic baseball announcers. And my dad, as some people know, was a colorful character and an inveterate gambler. And there wasn't any BetMGM or FanDuel. He had to pick up a phone using a code and bet with people, and I'm not exaggerating here, named Nunzio and Three Finger, you know?
Sounds like a Rickles bit. Sounds like a Don Rickles bit almost, but it was real.
No question. And by the time I was like 11 or 12, you give me any game, I would accurately give you the line, you know, because I knew, you know, I'd hear him pick up the phone. Yeah, give me the Yankees for a dime. That meant 1,000. A nickel meant 500. I understood what the VIG was because you know, just like with BetMGM and everything else, the game is always tilted toward the house. In this case, though, the house was guys who, if you didn't pay on time, might pay a very unfriendly visit to your house or your place of employment.
You don't want to see Jimmy two-time show up at your door.
A guy named Nunzio once did show up at our door, and it was the summertime. I remember we were in the pool in the backyard, and my dad instructed me to tell him he wasn't home. And there's 2 cars in the driveway, all right? And I'm like a 12-year-old kid. And yeah, John here? No, he's not here. When's he coming? I'm not sure. Tell him Nunzio was here. Okay, I will, okay. So that was the deal. So my dad, when he had bets on games, you know, there's no sports phone even, let alone internet or ESPN, nothing. So unless it's a local team, he can't follow the games. He almost always bet on the games he could see, but sometimes he needed more action. So he might bet on the Tigers. And then I had to go find WJR on the car radio and listen to Ernie Harwell in Detroit and run back in and report the score. One time when he was desperate, because he seldom bet hockey, but he bet a hockey game. And I had to go and find this Canadiens game against whoever the hell they were playing, the Red Wings or whatever. And for some reason, I couldn't pick up WJR, but I got some station out of Montreal. And I hear, Le Habitant de la Wings. Okay, 2-1, run back in and give them the report. And through all of this, I'm becoming even more enchanted with those voices in the night and the differences between them. You know, you could be good in so many different ways. Chuck Thompson had that pleasing baritone on WBAL in Baltimore. Bob Prince was quirky but perfect for Pittsburgh. I could get him on KDKA. Wade Hoyt on 3WE, WLW in Cincinnati. He had been a teammate and I think a roommate of Babe Ruth. And people used to root for rain delays because he'd tell these great stories. So I remember listening to him. Jimmy Dudley on the Cleveland Indians on 3WE. Ernie Harwell in Detroit. And on a really clear night from 800 miles away, Harry Carey and Jack Buck on the Cardinal games on KMOX. So at that point, I'm as much into the broadcasters almost as I am into the games. And I'm also smart enough by the time I'm 11 or 12 to figure out if I'm ever going to get into a ballpark without buying a ticket, it's going to be up in the booth. I'm not going to be standing in center field like these two guys. Yeah. So I guess that's when the bug really bit.
Good for you. Favorite at that? Was there one guy that had that influence? Maybe you took a little bit of liking to, and maybe started to style yourself a little bit after him.
You know, Scully went west with the Dodgers, but we lived in Redondo Beach in California for like a year and a half in the early 60s. We split town, and I later put the pieces together, and I realized that you couldn't trace people as easily then. And my dad took us 3,000 miles away until the heat was off before we came back. We didn't buy a house. We just rented an apartment. So I listened to Scully when I was 8, 9 years old. And I found him the most rhythmic, the most melodic. But I don't think you should try and copy anybody. You can be influenced by them. I was influenced by Jack Buck when I went to KMOX when I was just 22 years old. But I don't think people would listen to me at my best and think that he's like Jack Buck. But I was influenced in that Jack would slip in sly asides. He had that kind of Rat Pack sense of humor type thing, different generation, but I appreciated it. And Scully taught all of us that if you can do it deftly, you can work in a story without losing the narrative of the game. So, you know, little bits and pieces, but not copying. And I'm sure that's true of you also.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just picturing the two of you guys, you know, young Dave Sims, young Bob Costas. Like, you know, what would that have been like? You guys would have, Bob, hearing everything you just said, so similar, that even down to collecting cards. I'm left with an image. I don't really have a question, but I'm just picturing you guys hanging out as kids and being boys back then.
We would have been playing Stratomatic together or APBA, right?
No doubt about it.
Did you play stickball back in the day, Bob?
Absolutely played stickball. And we played with stickball or wiffle ball, or sometimes if you didn't have enough people, we would go to a handball court with a rubber ball, which in New York you called a Spalding or a Pensy Pinky, and we would chalk a strike zone on the wall, and then two of you could play, you know, pitcher against hitter. The pitcher almost always had the advantage because it's like 30 feet away, and he's firing a small ball at this strike zone, and you're trying to hit it with a stick. But I'll bet you played the same way as I did. You had to bat, even if you were right-handed. If you were the Yankees, when Roger Maris came up, you had to bat left-handed.
Yeah.
And when Mickey Mantle came up, you had to bat left-handed anyway because almost always the guy you were playing with was right-handed. Right. So you were screwed. You know?
Did you do what Anthony Wainwright and I did, where we would broadcast what we were doing as we were doing that, you know, one-on-one up against the wall like that? Now, here's the 2-2. Did you
Sometimes, always in my head, sometimes out loud, depending upon how tolerant my friends were. You know, when I got on their nerves, then I had to just take it internal.
Bob, you talked a little about Jack Buck. Could you talk some more about like what kind of influence he had on your career?
Well, I was 22 years old, and I sent an audition tape to KMOX in St. Louis just on a lark. The Carolina Cougars had moved to St. Louis to become the Spirits of St. Louis, who lasted for only 2 years and didn't get in when 4 teams were absorbed by the NBA. And my thought was, they're just taking a flyer on me. They're taking a look at me. They brought me in for an interview, and I met Jack Buck. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I have ties older than you, kid. Welcome to the big time." And I'm thinking, well, and I at that point didn't know what Jack Buck thought of me. And I think very understandably, I got the job, and I made a good impression on the audience and the people who ran the station pretty much right away, calling the basketball games. But Buck kind of held me at arm's distance. And I think about that in retrospect, that was appropriate. I had to prove myself, not just that I had a little bit of talent that could grow, but that I was carrying myself in the right way. And I've often thought about his son, Joe Buck, who's one of the best network TV play-by-play guys ever. But Joe had an advantage I didn't have. He grew up around it. I grew up dreaming of it. So a lot of what he absorbed by osmosis, I didn't have the advantage of. And I'm sure that in my exuberance, I was respectful to someone like Buck to the point of reverence. But I probably rubbed some people inadvertently the wrong way, just trying to make it act like I knew what I was doing or whatever. And until I settled in, it was a few years before Jack kind of figuratively put his arm around my shoulder. But after that, he was always very gracious to me, and I was, respectful of him from the jump.
Was there stuff that you slid in that you thought that maybe generationally it was something that might have irked him, or I was just curious, what you were talking about, that little nuance.
I had a little bit of New York sarcasm.
There you go.
And sometimes I did sports reports, and I'd throw in tart little asides, maybe. And I think that probably for some of the older guys there, it wasn't that you shouldn't do that, but you shouldn't do that until you've earned your spurs.
Gotcha.
It's okay if you do it 5 years from now. Just don't do it 5 minutes after you walked in the door.
Right.
Which is what I was doing.
Hey, who's this kid? Huh?
Right.
What the hell's he thinking about?
Ass.
Yeah, what the hell's he thinking about?
Nobody likes a wise ass.
Did these interactions change your outlook or how you interacted with younger broadcasters coming up as you've been a veteran in the game?
It's a good question, and I think that every younger broadcaster who's come along that I've ever crossed paths with has found me to be encouraging and willing to offer advice if they ask for it, and rooting for them. I've never been, there are people in this business, we don't have to name them. It's not a majority. I want to assure the audience, it's not a majority, but there are some people who think it's a zero-sum game, so that Dave's success somehow negatively impacts them, which is only true if you're vying for the exact same job. Others who have done well, I applaud it. If I'm just sitting at home, I want to watch someone who knows what they're doing and who is good at it. So I always felt that, I had my time and my place, and I've been very, very lucky. And I respected those who preceded me, and I was encouraging, I hope, to those who have followed me.
Now you talked about in past tense. Let me go right there. You decided to retire from doing play-by-play.
Yeah.
You're doing the playoffs this past, last month and a half ago. At what point did that decision just crystallize for you? You said, you know what, Uncle, that's it. It's been a great run. I'm done.
Well, firmly about a year and a half ago. And
Okay.
I just decided that this past year would be the last one, both for MLBN and more prominently at TBS, which was only a brief run, but it
Right.
did include 3 postseasons. And without getting too deep into all the particulars, Jeff Zucker had been my researcher in 1988 in Seoul, the first Olympics that I did.
I remember meeting him there.
First job out of Harvard. He was my researcher and Bryant Gumbel's researcher. He was a wunderkind, and by the time he was in his mid-20s, He's the producer of the Today Show. By the time he's in his 30s, he's running all of NBC Universal. And he and I had a great relationship, and he was always, in my corner. And so when I left NBC after 40 years, he's running CNN. And he contacts me and says, "You want to be a contributor?" I said, "Sure, no problem." And then HBO comes back to me. I had to give up HBO to join the baseball network because HBO insisted on cable exclusivity, but then they changed their approach and they said, "Yeah, stay at the baseball network, but come on over and do a show." So now, for a brief moment, and this is more detail than you want, but for a brief moment, Jeff became the head of Turner Sports. And he wanted to make a big splash. They just acquired the NHL, so he hires Wayne Gretzky. And he wants me to come over to be part of the baseball. Had it been anyone other than Jeff, I wouldn't have done it because I'd already settled by my own design into an emeritus situation with both the baseball network and even at NBC. NBC and I got sideways because they didn't like some of the stuff I said about CTE and football and some of the flaws at the IOC. So we got sideways, but I had, in my late 50s, said, "You know what? I'm done being the primary guy after 2016. So I've never been one who, wants to be dragged kicking and screaming out of the booth or hang on beyond my time. I did it as a favor to Jeff, and he was great to me. He gave me all the conditions and circumstances that I would have wanted. And then shortly after that, in an entirely different situation, he departs the what Time Warner Discovery or whatever it was called at that point. And in retrospect, after the first season, which was with Jeff, I probably should have said, "Hey, I came here because of him. Thanks a lot. Bye." But I fulfilled the last 2 years. And my hope was in the last year, let me just end on a grace note. It doesn't have to be a Ted Williams home run, maybe a Stan Musial single, just something that is in accord with the general quality and tone of the way it's been. And I didn't think I was quite able to do that. But even if I'd aced it this past October, it was going to be the end.
Yeah.
And again, maybe this is more than you bargained for in this answer, but Dave, it's a craft. It's not brain surgery, but it's a craft. I can still do everything I've ever done: the essays, the commentaries, the interviews, the studio stuff, the retrospectives. I can do that as well as I ever did. But I noticed some slippage in the play-by-play part, especially because I tried to do it in a way that had a different texture to it than most. I wasn't alone in that, but most people didn't approach it the same way,
Right.
where you're trying to have kind of a fabric to it that has history, that has anecdotes, that has a little bit of humor, that has stuff that just occurs to you, a relationship with the partner, all those things, and you're juggling those balls.
Right.
And just as you've been able to in your own way, I've been able to keep them in the air for a very long time. And occasionally, in recent years, some of those balls dropped. And I'm also aware that in a social media age, you can't get away with any of that. There are no misdemeanors on the internet. There's only felonies.
Yeah, and at the highest order.
Yeah, I get that. But if on my own terms, I had been as good as my career standard, and if a handful of people on the internet said, "Screw him, I don't want to hear a story about something that happened in 1975, even if it's historically relevant to what's happening in 2024, that would have had no effect on me. The decision was based on my own sense that I have too much regard for the game, for the craft, and for my own standard to hit below my lifetime batting average. If I could have come close to the lifetime batting average, fine. But I was too far beneath it to think that I should continue.
Right.
Long answer. I apologize.
No. That was good. It was good depth, and you feel good about it, right? You feel good about your decision?
Yes, I do feel good about it, Dave, because what happens, there's a kind of a gallows humor joke that they'll say all the nice things about you when you're dead and you can't hear about it. And when something like this happens, and I didn't mean for there to be a big announcement, but Andrew Marchand at The Athletic broke the story, and then I had to acknowledge it. I would have preferred something a bit more low key. But in the aftermath of that, then you sort of get these, appreciations for the whole career. And a lot of that has come my way. And as it happened, I received the Musial Award in St. Louis a week or so ago, and that's a big deal in St. Louis. And there was a big crowd and at a theater there, and being associated with that. Uh, a lot of good stuff has happened almost in the immediate aftermath of this. That's turned if it was a small negative emotionally, it's turned it around into a significant positive.
Bravo, bravo, bravo. So now let's backtrack a little bit. Cuse, going to Cuse. Long
Yeah.
Island guy. Now you're going up to the Cuse.
Yep.
Did you throw yourself like face first in all of this? All the broadcasting stuff that was available up there.
Yeah, I was on WAER like a month into my
Wow.
freshman year in 1970, the campus radio station. Even then, Syracuse had a reputation. Marty Glickman had gone there,
Yeah.
Marv Albert had gone there, Dick Stockton had gone there,
And Berman.
Ted Koppel and Dick Clark had gone there. But it wasn't the long list that has followed in the last 50 plus years, to where I'm not surprised at all when you see a new broadcaster. Oh, he's from Syracuse. Of course he's from Syracuse. More than half the industry is guys from Syracuse. Um, but when I heard myself on a cassette recorder the first time in October of 1970, my thought was, I'm doomed. Doomed. Thin, reedy voice, vestiges of a New York accent, central New York weather. I got no shot. And then 2 years after that, I'm listening to the World Series on the radio. The Reds are playing the A's, and Al Michaels is like the 26-year-old voice of the Reds. And I'm listening to Al Michaels. Who is this guy? And it wasn't as easy you couldn't Google, but I find out he's 26 years old. Wait a minute. I'm only 6 years younger than him. This guy's great. Again, I'm doomed. It's like I got no shot here. But luckily, things turned out a bit differently than that.
I'm wondering, you talk about imposter syndrome in a couple different instances, sort of like a lot of people go through that in their early beginnings of their career. Is that something that you kind of, acknowledged and just did your best, or is that something you just kind of fought through? How did you develop the confidence, I guess, and what would you advise younger people just starting out in broadcasting or anything else as far as how to deal with imposter syndrome?
It may sound contradictory, but don't be too hard on yourself, as I was at the beginning. Don't expect that right out of the box you're going to sound the way you hope to sound one day and have the mastery of it that you hope to have one day. But at the same time, you're going to be honest with yourself about the steps along the way that you have to take to get to that goal. And I was really lucky. There was a faculty member at Syracuse who took an interest in me. And he told me that through the years, he had kind of identified the handful of people among the dozens that came through WAER that he thought had professional potential, and that I was one of them. And he would listen to what I did, not because he needed to hear Syracuse against Rutgers on the campus station, but because it was part of what he did as a teacher, as a professor. And all the way through to when I was working at NBC, I would sometimes hear from him. I saw the game. It was good, but I didn't like this part. Or you should consider trying this instead of that. Because that was our relationship. I would always, he's since passed away, but he would always be my professor and I would always be his student, no matter how well I did. And that was something that I valued. But, to your point, he critiqued me, sometimes very directly, but he also was telling me that I had the potential and the ability to be good, and he was holding me to a standard that he thought I could reach.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. As a grown up, a graduate, and that still have somebody to do that and be that honest with you is extraordinary. You're very lucky in that regard.
I'll tell you a story that I know you will appreciate. He was a Red Sox fan, lived most of his life in Syracuse. And I'm doing a game with Jim Cott 10, 12 years ago on the Baseball Network. And I invited him to come to Fenway and watch the game from the booth. And I turned around during a commercial, and he had tears in his eyes. I was his protege. I mean, it's so pure.
Yeah.
That relationship, teacher to student, it's so pure. That's what his life was worthy of admiration.
That's beautiful. I've not heard a story like that from and I'm only you're only a year older than I am, so I've not heard a story like that. That's extraordinary and it's beautiful. It really
I'm
is.
just glad he wasn't around this October. He might have been doing different reason. What happened to my boy?
Dude. There was an interview you did back in 2011, and you, one of the things, a lot that you've done and who you are, great admiration, respect, good friendship. The Jerry Sandusky story in Pennsylvania, you have not been afraid to tackle some big time issues, my man. And I was wondering what the preparation was like and what you felt as you were going into that whole, the Jerry Sandusky story, the assistant coach at Penn State for Joe Paterno, molestation, that whole thing.
Yeah.
And you go from, hey, low ball 2, here's a 2-2 pitch to, Pedro, and you're going into this. Wow.
Well, everyone was trying to get the principals involved. Paterno was the main target, but no one ever got a sit-down interview with him when all this broke. But it broke in November of 2011, and all the networks were at State College. Everyone was trying to get something. And what NBC lined up was the guy who was then Sandusky's attorney, Joseph Amendola. And they sent a plane for him, and they flew him to New York. And because I had a sports background, which when you think about it, you didn't need a sports background. This was a news story. But I had done stuff over the years for NBC News. And they asked me to do the Amendola interview.
Wow.
So I had prepared to interview Amendola. So I read the grand jury presentation, and I knew the facts of the case. And I also spoke with people who had dealt with pedophiles and people that might have fit that profile, to learn some of the dynamics, like what are the grooming things that they do, and what are some of the excuses that they use. So I tried to get some of that background, and I was prepared to interview Amendola. And Amendola says to me, and we were going to tape the interview with him maybe 2 hours before the show was going to air, same night. And he says, if I can get Jerry on the phone, would you want to interview him? And the honest thought going through my head is, I don't think this is a great idea on your part. But my answer is, sure. So I just pivoted and used the preparation that I'd used to speak with Amendola to interview Sandusky. And at that point, although I thought my questions were fair, at that point, I think the majority of those watching found him guilty that night, way before he ever went on trial.
Wow. Have you ever done anything that news, outside of the sports realm, that was as explosive as that particular story?
No, not breaking news, but I did the late night show from the late 80s to the mid 90s that followed David Letterman on NBC. And one of my regrets is I never should have left it when I did. But I had so much on my plate, and my kids were young, and I was commuting between St. Louis and New York. And so I stopped after 6 years. It has a new life now on YouTube, and I hear from people all the time. The first time I heard a few years ago, someone says, I saw you last night with Dennis Hopper. I'm thinking, what was it, a seance? Dennis Hopper's dead. But now I get it. So I interviewed a lot of politicians and actors, directors, that sort of writers, but not breaking news. The closest thing to that would have been Mickey Mantle right after he came out of the Betty Ford clinic. But that was newsworthy, but it was more a profile of him, where I created, I hope, the circumstances where he was comfortable enough to tell his story the way he wanted to tell it. But from a breaking news standpoint, no. I was part of the coverage when the bomb went off in Centennial Park in 1996 in Atlanta. Back in 72, an even more tragic situation, the murder of the Israeli athletes by the Palestinian terrorists. Jim McKay distinguished himself with his journalistically excellent but also humanly sensitive coverage of that whole situation. And he wasn't a boastful man, but he took pride in the fact that he got a telegram the next morning when people still sent telegrams. You did your profession proud, and it was signed by Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, doesn't get any better than that.
Can't get any better than that. So when the bomb blew up in Centennial Park, Tom Brokaw was there. In 72, ABC News didn't have its full presence. Peter Jennings is like in New York, wherever the hell he is, but Brokaw was there in Atlanta. So as soon as they could wake him up in the hotel and get him there, he anchored the coverage. And Hannah Storm, Jim Lampley, and I were kind of peripheral to that, but we had a piece of the coverage. But it doesn't measure up to other circumstances that you could.
As far as breaking news, your life has a Secret Life of Walter Mitty or Forrest Gump quality to it. As far as you're having been at the center of so many different things, I just remember most recently really loving your being a key player in Mr. McMahon, the Netflix documentary. Having no idea before watching that you fell in love with professional wrestling. How did that come about? And then how did you get involved in it?
I was surprised in watching it. I expected that they would use footage from the HBO interview from like 20 years ago. But I was surprised that there was so much footage of me in the mid 80s. NBC did some tongue in cheek coverage on a show called Sports World, which was NBC's answer to the gold standard, ABC's Wide World of Sports. So we did a whole show devoted to what was then the WWF with a kind of tongue in cheek appreciation. And when I was a kid, I used to watch wrestling, black and white, Bobo Brazil versus Haystacks Calhoun, and all that stuff. I'm 9 years old, but I know it's fixed, but it's funny, And I in the 80s, I thought it was funny. So I was willing. They asked me to be part of WrestleMania 3, and by that point, I saw which way the wind was blowing, and I said no. But prior to that, there was a card at Madison Square Garden, and they asked me to be the ring announcer. And I thought, this is great. This is just it's like being on Letterman. It's like all tongue in cheek. So I put on a tuxedo, and they lowered that ring mic like I was Johnny Addy.
Johnny Addy.
It was like Joe Louis, and the challenger, Tony Galento. So down comes the thing, right? And it's just so much fun. But when it took an uglier turn, then I turned away from it. But they interviewed me for the Mr. McMahon thing, and I guess I keep hearing about it from people. There's a story connected. It isn't Johnny Addy. It's John Condon, and you probably heard this.
John
Dave.
Francis Xavier Condon,
Right,
Host of the Garden.
PA guy for the Knicks and I guess the Rangers probably, right? So there's a fight at Madison Square Garden, and I forget who the fighters are. And he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, Gladys Gooding will now play our national anthem." And for some reason, there's a delay, and there's a hush over the crowd, and from the balcony comes a leather-lunged voice, "Gladys Gooding sucks!" And Condon pauses for a second and says, "Nevertheless, she will now play our national anthem." Nevertheless is now kind of a thing. It probably has faded away. But for when we were younger, 30, 40 years ago, if something got screwed up,
Right.
It's very likely the producer in your ear go, "Nevertheless," like we'll plow for wrong graphic, wrong score, screwed the whole thing. Nevertheless.
Then they're done that.
Yep.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Oh my goodness. These guys, Jared and Jordy, the 90s, when you were front facing the NBA, and John Tesh's what? Round Ball Rock?
Round Ball Rock, yeah.
That's their deal, man. That is their jam. Woo!
Yeah, big time, Bob. You were the soundtrack, the voice of my youth. In addition to the Notorious B.I.G., there's Bob Costas with your monologue before games.
That's me and Biggie and Tupac, but I'm still here, I think. My street cred was through the roof. Just ask Ludacris.
Oh, I love. Go ahead. Can you give us the line? Do you remember the line?
Oh, of course I do. I be rolling torpedoes, get blunted with Rostas, and for a hefty fee, I'm on your record, like Bob Costas.
Nailed it. How did you come up with those intros for NBA and NBC? Was that how'd you prepare how'd you write those?
Dick Ebersol gets a lot of credit. He learned from Roone Arledge that network TV sports, be it Monday Night Football, which Arledge helmed, be it ABC's Olympic coverage anchored by Jim McKay, it was about storytelling. It wasn't enough to say 2nd and 10, pass over the middle for 15 yards, first down. There had to be more, especially to bring in the casual fans. And then Ebersol brought that to NBC's coverage of the Olympics, but also on the NBA. And in fact, almost everything we did. If you look at old World Series games from the 90s, every game began with something that framed not the nuts and bolts, but the drama. What's at stake here? What's the history of it? Who are the main participants in the drama? And of course, in the 90s, it was more often than not, it was Michael Jordan. And the storylines almost suggested themselves. And what we tried to do, what I tried to do along with the producers, was to do something that was simultaneously dramatic, but also in some small way journalistically legitimate. Like it wasn't bullshit, it wasn't hype. It was emphasizing the drama that was already there. And in Michael Jordan, you had the perfect leading man.
No question.
And then, people associate it. I think now there's talk that NBC has gotten the NBA back starting next season. And whatever else they do differently, I think Ground Ball Rock's coming back. Because
I don't think there's any question. We use it, I do FS1, and it's still, when I hear it played as we're coming on the air, I still think back to you guys. I mean, that's how big an impact it was. I mean, it's really weird. I'm sort of used to it, but that first year that Fox used it, wow, I said, am I at the right network? What am I doing?
They always, with the NBA, if there was a signature, it was Game 5, next, dun, 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 dun. And people have said to me through the years, they got so psyched up, they wanted to play the game. They wanted to head to the schoolyard, but if they did, they'd miss the game. But they got goosebumps from it. And a lot of it had to do with how well it was produced by the NBC people.
Jordy said he's getting them right now.
Yeah, that I mean, I remember distinctly, obviously the finals, Michael Jordan's last game with the Bulls, he has that steal and the iconic shot, and you have the great call. I had to do a computer project in computer class in 4th grade. That happened. So that was 98, the June 98. Yeah. And that was, I used your call from that last sequence. What? So that is seared in my brain. What memories do you have of that game, calling his last game with the Bulls?
Thank you. You couldn't ask for a more dramatic exit. Derek Jeter gets a base hit, a walk-off base hit in his last game at Yankee Stadium, but it wasn't in the World Series. Ted Williams hits a home run in his last time at bat. Wasn't in the World Series. Kobe goes for 60 against Utah in his last game. I mean, that's great, but it's not in the NBA Finals. This takes defeat and turns it into victory by 1 point right at the end of the game. It couldn't be any more classic. He holds it like this as if he's posing for a statue. Everything about it, if you wrote a script, you could not improve upon it. He's 6 for 6 in the finals. He's the MVP of the finals every time. He scores 45 points in that game, and the final score of the game is I think 87-86. So now when the average game is, 125 to 118, 45 points means something different than it meant then, when he scored more than half his team's points and Scottie Pippen has a bad back and he's hobbling around. This is, in an athletic sense, heroic. And it's also classic. So, he gave me a canvas to work with, and at least I didn't screw it up.
Man, oh man. Covering NBA, baseball, NFL, Olympics, going from play-by-play to hosting. How do you switch jackets, switch gears?
I guess I was just reasonably versatile. I think Mike Tirico has that facility. Excellent host and excellent play-by-play man. And I think a lot of that comes from growing up following it. And again, not copying anybody, but identifying excellence. Who's good at it? And why are they good at it? And how can I take those principles and make them my own so it's true to me, but what it has in common is the principles of it. So, Mike and I have similarities. And I think I had an influence on him, if only because he was the first recipient of the scholarship in my name at Syracuse in 1987. And I landed in that generation. And like in the 90s, just by happenstance, NBC had everything.
Yeah.
There were
no
years
kidding.
when we had the Super Bowl, the NBA Finals, the All-Star Game, the LCS or World Series and the Olympics.
Right.
You know? So, yeah, I was kind of unavoidable. So
Yeah.
I guess I just seeped into a lot of young broadcasters' heads.
And Tirico, a New York guy, goes to Syracuse. So, a little parallel right there. I remember seeing when I was doing Big East football, I'd see him. I remember seeing he was a sophomore and he was already the number one sportscaster in Syracuse.
Yeah, and he was identified. All of his classmates at Syracuse knew he was a prodigy. That he was bound for really big things. He gets all of it right. All of us are different. He does many of the same sorts of things I do or did in his own way, and he's excellent in his own way.
When did both of you first meet? That's the one. That's the question I don't know. When was it a Runyons, old school Runyons get together in the 80s?
Me and your dad?
Yeah.
What is our first meeting? It might have been around the Costas Coast to Coast radio show.
Because it was right around the corner from where we lived. You did it in the second Runyons, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And then when I was at WNBC Radio, second floor 30 Rock, I remember I had you come down. You did some drops for us, and you said you did some drops for us, and they sat down, and Mike Green was our producer, and we had some laughs a few times, yeah. And then I what was it? I remember you. Now this is going way back. I think it was a preseason NFL get together with Enberg and all the boys come in. Mike Weissman had everybody in, and he'd tell us a story about a wedding, and you had Chubby Checker coming in, and I think that's going way back. That's like 79, 80, 81 ish.
It had to be after 83 because that's
83. Okay, so 83.
And this is how you turn a weakness into a strength. I am not a good dancer, but the one dance I knew I could do was the twist. Okay, so we had a standard wedding band. They're playing "We've Only Just Begun" or whatever the hell they do. But unbeknownst to almost anybody, I had contracted with Chubby Checker to come in and do. He started with the twist and he ended with the twist, but he did like some rock standards, like "No Particular Place to Go," Chuck Berry stuff in between. So we did like a half dozen song concert, and the place went nuts. And then you got a few like old biddies that are like second cousins of the mother of the bride or something. Oh, well, who cares? It was great.
I mean, it's Chubby Checker, Arnold Cream from what's his name? I can't remember his real name, but he's from Philly. I know that.
Oh, Ernest Evans.
Ernest Evans, that's what I was talking.
Yeah. I last saw Chubby at Muhammad Ali's funeral in Louisville in 2016, but our paths have crossed many times since then. And, a real friendship grew out of that. I think he lives in Sweden, either Sweden or Switzerland.
Wow. Didn't know that. It's a long way from...
Still looks great.
Yeah, good for him. The mantle card do you still have that mantle card, that 52 mantle card?
No, 58. If it was 52, it would be worth even more.
Yeah.
And I would go get it for you, but I'd have to run upstairs. But when I leave the house, I always have it on me somewhere because fans ask to see it, and I don't want to look like a fraud. So I produced it for them. And, dishearteningly, about half the time, the question is, wow, what's that worth? Here's what it's worth. Not in the wallet. Here's what it's worth.
Is it signed by the Mick?
No.
Okay, so you got it out. Now you were lucky enough to get it out of the pack, chew the gum, and you're like, whoa.
Yeah, and you know what happened subsequently?
Wow.
Tony Kubek, who was my broadcast partner in the 80s on the NBC Game of the Week and was a teammate of Mickey's on the great Yankee teams, he told the story on the air. He saw the card. He told the story on the air. And after that, Sports Illustrated did a tiny little piece about it. And then it became, sort of common knowledge. And here's another thing. It's just kind of sweet. On my birthday or on Christmas, doesn't happen every year, but now and then, someone sends me a Mickey Mantle card with a note that says, "I've always enjoyed your career. I share your love of baseball. Please take this as a token of my appreciation." So I have about a half dozen of them, so that when it gets too dog-eared, and I have one that's in a case that's going to...
I would hope.
Close to mint condition. But when it gets too dog-eared, then I just replace it with the next one.
So you're talking about the love of baseball card collecting, but the business is... How insane is it?
It's crazy. But the market, if there's a market for it, Somebody wants to spend $3 million for a baseball card. That establishes what the market is. Supposedly, you know, I have a number of cards. They're not all the 58 cards. People send me these cards. And I guess they all have value. Even one, let's say from 1964, if it's a decent condition, it's probably worth, low four figures. But I just don't look at it that way.
Yeah, you still you still have the love for it.
What was the last time both of you guys have ripped open a pack?
A guy wrote a book. I'm going to get his name wrong, so I'm not even going to try it. It's kind of a tricky last name. But he wrote a book called The Wax Pack. And here's what he did. Here was his premise. He took a pack from the 1980s and he opened it up. And whatever 5 or 6 guys are in this pack, they were going to be the guys that he tried to track down and write a book about his travels, write it around his travels by car, what's happening in his life. He's getting engaged or whatever, the roadside bars he stopped in, all that stuff. He weaves that throughout the story, and he's looking to find Vince Coleman or somebody, and write about what he found. And some of the guys were welcoming to him, others blew him off, but he wrote a whole book about it, which to baby boomers resonated.
Oh yeah.
So I think the last time I opened a pack, he sent me a pack and asked me to open it and give him my impressions of the players that were in the pack. So that's probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Were they guys in the pack that you're familiar with or very familiar with?
Yeah, most of them, yeah.
Yeah,
Most of them, at least you know the name.
Yeah. Yeah, he had 210 one year. He really killed us.
Right. Bob Uecker and I, whenever we text, and Bob is 90 now, beyond to call him a legend is inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
But when we text with each other, we sign it with a random name of a ball player from his era. So the last time I said, "Hey, happy Thanksgiving, best wishes, Dave Wickersham," and he says, "Same to you, Lou Klimchak." But this has been going on for 20 years.
Yeah.
But you're not allowed to repeat. You can't repeat.
Yeah, I have a similar relationship with Malcolm Moran, who you probably know used to be at the New York Times.
Yeah.
And we just open it up to everybody. Pepper Martin. Hey, I'm looking for Diego Segui.
Right. The Ancient Mariner, Diego Segui.
Exactly. You've been parodied a few times on SNL.
Yeah.
What was like? You go home, hey, tonight, and there's somebody doing you on SNL. What was your reaction to that?
I was thrilled. It wasn't. None of it was mean spirited.
Okay.
It was Darrell Hammond.
Oh, he was
usually.
Good.
Yeah. And he actually did a bit. He was on the Baseball Network, and my son Keith is part of the Hot Stove show in the off season. And so Hammond is a guest, and he's imitating me, telling him that he can't do me. So he's going, "You got the great Clinton. You got the great Koppel. You got the great Gore. You tried to do me, and you failed utterly." Now, I don't sound like that, but so what? I think he actually proved my point. But it's all good natured.
I really liked his work. I
he was great. He's now the announcer. He's got the Don Pardo role. That's Darrell that you hear, running down everything that's on SNL.
I couldn't put it together. I'm usually pretty good on that. Wow, that's
a sweet guy.
Yeah, good, very good.
I gotta ask something. I would be mad at myself if we concluded this without asking about the Spirits of St. Louis. We're clearly, my brother and I, big basketball guys, and your connection to the city of St. Louis has come up a few times in this interview. What are some of your overarching memories of your time doing games for them and the ABA in general?
If you really want to know about the ABA, there are a couple of good HBO. Well, one was HBO, kind of a history of the ABA, and then there was one called Free Spirits, which might have aired on ESPN. That was just about the spirits. And then there's Terry Pluto's book Loose Balls, which is one of the best sports books ever. It's an oral history of the ABA. If there was one team that exemplified the ridiculous and the sublime of the ABA, that team was the Spirits of St. Louis. Um, we had enough talent to be a contending team in the NBA if that talent ever coalesced, which it did for brief periods of time. But when your key player, Marvin Barnes, is one of the most talented players of his time and also one of the most irresponsible people in the history of the world, then things tend to fall apart despite the best efforts of veterans like Ron Boone and Freddie Lewis to hold it together. And the crazy part of this is that my first two jobs were play-by-play for the Syracuse Blazers of the Eastern Hockey League, which is the Paul Newman Slapshot League. Some of the players who were extras in the movie I knew from the league. They played for the Johnstown Jets or the Syracuse Blazers. And the Ogie Oglethorpe character is modeled after Bill Harpo Goldthorpe of the Blazers, who was the most crazy enforcer in the history of hockey. And so I knew this was nuts. And then I go to the Spirits and I kind of know that this is nuts, but I have nothing really to compare it to. And it's only after a half century goes by and I realize that in the ensuing 48 years, I have not seen anything that approaches what I saw in the first 2 or 3 years with minor league hockey and ABA basketball. It was so much fun. And just to show you, I was in St. Louis a week ago, just before Thanksgiving. And there are people who live in St. Louis who were young kids in their 20s who worked for the Spirits. You know, they might have been in the PR department or community relations, whatever. And 8 of us got together with our spouses just to swap stories about the Spirits and about the ABA. And, you know, it's almost like a secret fraternity. If I see Dr. J, it's different than if I see Larry Bird, you know, because Dr. J and I are ABA guys. No matter what he did in the NBA, we're ABA guys. If a guy was a trainer for the Kentucky Colonels, he's part of the fraternity too. And we carry a little chip on our shoulder because we know that it was better than people gave us credit for. And then when the merger happened, in the first year after the merger, 5 of the 10 starters in the final between the Trailblazers and the Sixers had come straight out of the ABA.
Absolutely.
And 10 of the 24 players in the first post-merger All-Star game had played in the ABA. So we feel vindicated.
Yeah. Wow.
I remember really well one of the things I took away from that documentary, the one I think it was on ESPN, one of the all-time business deals ever. And then I'm thinking like Rocky, like Sylvester Stallone, and holding out for ownership and rights and saying I got to play the part. It's like up there at that level.
Here's what happened. I may have the figures slightly wrong, but I think they bought the team, the Silna brothers, who were basketball fans and who had made their fortune in textiles of some kind. I think they were like early on. This is not a joke. Like the double knits when everyone was wearing like leisure
Yeah, right.
double knit pants.
Remember them well.
Like they were in on the ground floor. I think they bought the team for like $2 million. And in the course of the 2 years, they lost like $3 million. Okay, so now the last year starts with 10 teams. 3 of them fold. They can't make it to the finish line of the season. There's 7 teams. The NBA wants the Spurs, the Nuggets, the Nets, and the Pacers, all solid franchises. They don't want the Squires, the Colonels, which is a shame because they did pretty well at Freedom Hall in Louisville, and that's basketball country, and the Spirits. They don't want those 3. They got to make them go away and not file an antitrust suit. So they reach a financial settlement with the Squires, who were deeply in debt, their owners were. And they let John Y. Brown, who owned the Colonels, buy into the NBA, and he bought the Buffalo Braves, I think. Okay.
That's right,
now
yeah.
what are we going to do with the Spirits to make them go away? And they had a young attorney, Syracuse grad as it happens, named Don Shupak. And Shupak says in the negotiations, now wait a minute, if we were in the league, we'd get a slice of the network TV money, wouldn't we? Well, yeah. And at this time, you got to remember, the NBA finals are on tape delay.
That's right. That was
much of the
terrible.
country.
Okay.
You know, yes, okay. So they propose that they get 1/7 of what would have been the combined network TV take of the 4 teams that got in, 1/7. And then he put in an important clause, in perpetuity.
Yep.
Now
Winner.
at the time, now you would think that the NBA's attorneys would be smarter than that. But at the time, each team has taken probably less than $1 million out of the deal. 700 grand, 800 grand, maybe. So, okay, this is enough. We'll make them go away. And then not long after, Bird and Magic come along. Michael comes along. The whole thing explodes. The Dream Team comes along. The game goes global. I mean, in theory, under the terms of this deal, if there were ever NBA games on Saturn, they would have been entitled to their take. The NBA tried for years and years to reach a settlement, and the Silners kept saying no. But then it got to the point you get older and you want to settle your estate. So they finally took a buyout of some kind. But I think that they came close, definitely more than 500 million, and maybe close to $1 billion on what turned out to be a $5 million investment.
Did the Squires? How much money did they get for their buyout?
Low millions. Whatever covered their debt, I guess. And then there was a dispersal draft, and so the teams got money. They put a price on. Okay, Moses Malone is worth this, and Marvin Barnes is worth that, and Maurice Lucas is worth that, and whatever team, let's say the Trailblazers, whoever the hell took Moses Malone, probably Houston at that point, I forget. But anyway, that whatever the price was for that free agent out of the ABA went to his original team. So that was part of the buyout. But I don't think the Squires at that point had any big stars.
No, Doc had been gone. Gervin had been with them, if I remember. Fly Williams, you got some stories? Yeah, I knew that would get a reaction. I knew that would get. He was a heck of a player.
Last I checked, Fly was still around and kind of a street guy in Brooklyn.
Wow.
He was a Rucker League legend. He had game. It wasn't a disciplined game, but he had game. He went to Austin Peay, and as legend has it, and this story may be apocryphal, but I just want it to be true, that he flew from LaGuardia to Austin, Texas, thinking that Austin Peay must be in Austin, Texas. This is where he's matriculating, but turns out Austin Peay is in Tennessee. And while he was there, and I think he came out after his sophomore year, the student chant at their games was, "The fly is open, let's go pee." Right?
The best. So, can't make it up. You can't make it up.
So the second game, I think, of the Spirits, Fly comes off the bench and scores like 24. And he must have hit like 8 of 10 or something. And, he's exuberant and the whole deal. And the Spirits didn't have that big a fan base, but he became a fan favorite. But he was a somewhat less than disciplined player. And his playing time diminished as the season went along. We had a reunion, a 40th reunion of the team 10 years ago, because the first season was 74-75. And the owners sent plane tickets and hotel accommodations in St. Louis to everybody, including Fly. And then Fly didn't show up.
Ugh.
So.
Oh, wow. I want to put a bow on this. You going to be doing any other broadcast things that are coming up? Or have you really landed the plane?
No, I'll continue in an emeritus role at the Major League Baseball Network.
Okay.
Doing all the things that I have been doing other than the play-by-play.
Okay.
And I think I can still make a solid contribution there with the historical stuff and other sorts of things.
Yeah.
And I think that there may be some other things on the horizon, but at this point, it has to be a perfect fit. I'm not looking for work just for the sake of a paycheck or just for the sake of being on the air. If I'm on the air, I want it to be worthwhile, and I want people to say, yeah, that's what he should be doing now.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right. How would you summarize your career? I mean, you're gonna be around for a long time, but how would you summarize? Because it's one of the great runs in the history of our business.
I've been really lucky, and I think if anything, I checked a lot of boxes. I did a lot of different things pretty well, not just different sports, but different things within.
Right.
Hosting, play-by-play, interviewing, commentary, journalistic stuff. So I think in that respect, I probably checked more boxes than some of my contemporaries. But those contemporaries Al Michaels, Dick Enberg, a little bit ahead of me, Enberg, Jim Nance, now Tirico, Joe Buck. They're all terrific in their own way. There's lots of ways to be good. There isn't one objective standard. It isn't like a race where somebody objectively gets there first. There's lots of ways to be good. And in truth, to be good, you have to be somewhat distinctive. The world would be better. The world of sportscasting, not going to change the course of Western civilization,
No.
but why would you want two Al Michaels when you could have an Al Michaels and a Mike Tirico, or you could have an Iron Eagle coming along now, and now a Noah Eagle who's his mini me. It's frightening.
And it isn't it?
It's frightening, right? But of course, they both went to Syracuse. That's
of course they did. Of course they did. Yeah, he that is one of the great mini me's I've seen at 50,
physically
60.
and the voice.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
when Noah gets excited, he hits exact pitch and timbre as his dad. It's scary. Sometimes you have to okay, which one was it?
Right, like Joe Buck, you can hear vestiges of Jack Buck and Joe Buck, but it's not identical.
Right.
Noah's identical to Ian, but since Ian's really good, nothing wrong with that.
Before we head out, Bob, just the Pedro Strop call. Did you ever anticipate that would go as viral as it did? And could you walk us through that moment?
It is so crazy because I have people sometimes come up to me and say, "That's one of my favorite things that you ever did. That was just great." And it's one of the few things that I really wish I could expunge from the record, because while I hope that I was irreverent, in fact, someone once wrote about me way back when, one of my favorite things, they said, he's reverent and irreverent at the same time. And my thought was, I hope so. So, having a sarcastic remark or a little bit of a jab where it's called for, I'm good with that. But I'm not mean spirited, and that just came out wrong. I had a thought for a while. Every time a guy gets a bloop single, he doesn't have to arrive at first base and gesture toward his dear departed aunt, who supposedly is like sitting on top of a cloud playing a harp, surrounded by angels. Let's save that for the big moments. We don't have to celebrate the least possible accomplishment. So that notion was in my head, and Pedro Strop comes walking off the mound. This was the wrong time to try and make this point. And he points toward the heavens. And he's like faced 4 batters and given up 3 hits and a sacrifice fly and a walker or something. Okay. And I don't think they're going to a commercial. So now I go, Pedro Strop exits, pointing toward the heavens, 5, 4. Now I got to wrap this up. And I didn't do a good job of it. And when the game was over, this happened late in the game, the producer, Chris Pfeiffer, calls me in the hotel room in St. Louis, and he says, that didn't come out the way you wanted it to. And I knew he was right. So the next day, I went right up to Pedro Strop. This is what you do in the real world, not the internet world, not the social media bullshit, I'll put out a tweet world.
Bingo.
You go right up to the guy and you go, hey, I screwed this up. I'm sorry. My bad. And he was so cool, such a good guy. This is what he said. He said, my friend, my teammates tell me you're a good guy and you're one of the best at what you do. It's okay. We all make mistakes. I had a bad outing last night too. That's how classy he was. And every time our paths crossed subsequently, if I was doing a Cub game, I'd go in the clubhouse to say hello to him. He was so cool about the whole thing. But I wish if I had a magic wand that I could remove 2 or 3 things, that'd be one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. It happens to everybody, man. I got a couple that, ooh, ouch. There's no.
But by the way, it would have been, if I'd done it better and at a more appropriate time, it would have been a good point to make. Like, hey, back off. Do we have to celebrate with some sort of spiritual surrounding kind of thing? The least accomplishment. I ran back a punt for 6 yards with my team losing by 3 touchdowns. Just go to the bench and be quiet.
Yeah, amen.
Bob, I remember very well. You reminded me of when was it the start of NBC of football on NBC? What was the name of the show?
Football Night in America.
Football Night in America. Thank you. And Dad, I guess you were doing Sunday night. That was the game of the week, right? You were on the radio, CBS Westwood One. And so Bob, I remember Plaxico. There was a player who did the pantomime shoot yourself in the foot. And you had a monologue about that. And that was the similar point, but just made perfect timing. And I just remember loving that you called that out.
Similar point, well made. The other the other point, not nearly as well made. Luckily for me, I mean, if Pedro Strop was a different guy,
Oof,
might have had a different ending.
yeah.
Thankfully, he was a classy guy.
Jordy?
No, I'm just appreciative for you joining us. I was just thinking, like, your voice, you have one of those voices that makes me like emotional about sports. It's weird to say, but you and few people have that for me. So
Thank you. And it makes sense, when you say you're in fourth grade in '98. My son Keith was always traveled with me. The school was out just about the time the NBA Finals hit, and he'd be with me through all that stuff. And he was in the sixth grade then, so it's kind of a similar thing. And there's nothing like seeing sports through the eyes of a child and sharing it with them.
No doubt.
That excitement that they feel, the innocence of it, the purity of it, and to have somebody say, "I remember you," even if I'm kind of a peripheral player in it. I remember you from when I was a kid. That means something different than
Wow.
I remember you from when I was 40 years old.
Yeah.
It's just different.
Yeah. No doubt
Um,
about it.
let me ask you something, Dave. You're headed for New York. You're headed for your hometown, but for so many years in Seattle. Uh, are you going to approach it the same way, or do you have to adjust a little bit?
Well, to New York Yankees, in terms of approach, I'm gonna try to as the song goes, to try to just be. I got to be me, and certainly there's legacy and reverence that goes with the New York Yankee brand.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about that. I am well aware of that. I haven't. I'm just looking forward to the opportunity. I mean, I'm going to begin my study period next week and bone up on a lot of stuff that I know I need to.
Yeah.
But I'm excited, and I think I'm going to try to bring the exact same verve and energy and storytelling and working with Susan Waldman, who are friends and have been for a long time. So I think we got a chance to have a very good run. So I'm looking forward to it. Believe me, having grown up watching the Yankees, like I said, I'm only a year behind you, so I've experienced that same, viewing the Yankees in that aura, which is
Mm-hmm.
legit. I mean, through the early stages of my life. So
Yeah.
hopefully I can be a part of it moving forward here.
You know that history is in every moment at Yankee Stadium.
You bet.
You're surrounded by it. A lot of times, of course, everyone resents, at least half the country always resents the Yankees.
Oh
They
my
resent
goodness.
Notre Dame. They resent the Lakers or the
The
Celtics or
Cowboys,
whatever it
Celtics.
is.
Yep.
The Dodgers now.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're doing a national game, you can't say if the Mariners play. Remember, I did Mariners Yankees in 2000 in the LCS.
Yeah.
And you're trying to be as appreciative of each team as you can in the moment. And already the Mariners had Ken Griffey Jr. and the young A-Rod and
Mm-hmm.
Edgar Martinez
Edgar.
and Randy
Sure.
Johnson on the mound. But you can't say they have the history. There's not echoes of Joe DiMaggio
Not
and
even
Babe
close.
Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Mickey Mantle, and now they've added to it with Derek Jeter and all of Aaron Judge and all the rest. And the reminders are constant. Monument Park is right in front of you. The facade, the same kind of thing as from 1923.
Absolutely.
It's there, and so you don't have to worry about it because you're doing it to a Yankee audience.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily you grew up in New York, so you appreciate this. That has to be part of it, even if it's not direct. An implied appreciation of that.
Oh, without a doubt,
Has to be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, even now, even when the Mariners would come here to New York, and you talk about how people hate them. I caught heck first few years because the Yankees were good and they were doing some numbers, and I was like, hey, Mariano Rivera, Jeter did something. You're not good. It's not a funeral. It's a baseball game, and people were giving me crap for it. I said, screw it. I just kept moving forward. But I hear what you're saying. No, I'm well aware, and I've already heard from a whole bunch of people in that regard, and a lot of it you don't even. I mean, I know that.
And a lot of it for your present audience, a lot of it is the Jeter-Torre Yankees. Yeah, they're aware of Mantle and Maris and Whitey Ford and Yogi Berra, but there are people that are 50 years old now, and their team is Bernie Williams and Rivera and Jeter and Torre.
Posada.
That's their team.
Right.
Yeah, Posada. And by the way, David Cohn and Paul O'Neill are right down the hall in the TV booth
next door. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's reeking of history.
I love it, though. I mean, and again, that's one of the reasons I'm in the business. My dad raised me going to games. I've been going to games since I think the first football game I saw, Jim Brown, 1958. I was 5. Another Syracuse guy. And it was like,
yes.
And I tell the story all the time. It was like Black Jesus coming to town. You know, my father was must have been 10 of his, he and his friends and their sons, and we went to see him Browns Eagles, and I remember going to see Mays and all the Koufax and all those guys. So I grew up in all this stuff. So as I always say, I wasn't born to be a chemist. I know
that. People ask me, what would you do? What would you do if you weren't a broadcaster? And I only half jokingly say, I might be a ward of the state.
Yeah, right. Nunzio, right?
Well, I don't know, maybe. Because if I don't know. Luckily, I was pretty good at this one thing.
Yeah,
that served me well. But I don't know what else I could really do. And about a month ago, my wife and I are out to dinner in California, where I am now. So we go to this restaurant that we go to frequently, and the valet guy knows me. And he parked the car right up against the curb on this particular occasion, so he didn't have to flip me the keys. It was already there. So we come out, and I hit the accelerator, and the car kind of lurches. So I'm like, where's the parking brake? And I'm looking, and we've had the car for years. I can't find it. So Jill leans over from the passenger seat, and she goes under the steering wheel, and it's under the steering wheel. It's not down on the floor where I thought it was. And as we pulled out, I said, by now you should be aware of this. I know a lot of things that almost nobody knows. And I don't know a lot of things that almost everybody knows.
So true. So, yeah, man. Hey, preach, brother.
That's
preach.
the truth.
Hey, Bob, we have thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you so much for giving us some time, man. It means a lot.
Guys,
thank you so much.
Happy holidays. Look forward to seeing you at Yankee Stadium.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll get together for lunch or dinner. We'll both be in town.
Absolutely. When you come, holler when you get back to town.
I will.
All right. Very good.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Dave Sims from the Hey Now podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us here on the Hey Now podcast.
I can't stand